Duginism is to the right what cultural Marxism is to the left, only a lot worse. A lot worse because we've come to witness also the rise of the Duginist left lately, such as the coalition of the radical left, or Syriza, in Greece. Sadly, the establishmentarian right and the establishmentarian left have done very little to combat Duginism, partly because they don't know what it is, and partly because they're just too hysterical and thus incapable of understanding what they're really up against. So, in this episode, we will try our best to understand what Duginism is, how it works in practice, and why it matters. Let's explore! Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. Well, this is probably the most complicated video so far because the whole thing is just too complex and fringe-worthy. And cringe-worthy, but fringe-worthy in particular. Sadly, Duginism is less and less fringe, not because Duginism is correct or a fair alternative to the failures of liberalism, but because Duginism is vague enough to attract disgruntled totalitarians of every stripe. Add to that the never-ending chain of stupidity of mainstream politicians like François Hollande, Angela Merkel, Federica Mogherini, Stefan Löfven, and others like that, and it's getting increasingly easier to see why Duginism is taking roots once you understand what Duginism is, especially once you also take into account the inherent anti-Americanism that is widely practiced in all too many intellectual circles in Europe. The beauty of Duginism and its inherently chameleonic nature, and I mean it when I say the beauty, because whilst I utterly loathe Duginism and I loathe the fact that it even has any type of influence, I do have to admire the simple yet highly efficient agitprop conducted by its followers. Anyway, we'll get into the minutiae of things in the following minutes, or maybe the following hour, because this video might actually get very long. So, first things first, let's deal with the name. Now, Duginism, the name is more or less informal and comes from the ideology's founder, Aleksandr Dugin, professor of political science at the Moscow State University and the de facto ideologue of the Kremlin in the last 5 or 6 years, depending on which source do you trust. Now, Dugin wrote roughly 3 dozens of books and hundreds, if not thousands, of articles, so the bibliography is quite burdensome. Now, I read 3 of the books and maybe 100 or so of his articles. By the way, he also makes videos on YouTube, and his videos are a lot more interesting if you speak Russian, because then you have the chance of watching his videos in Russian and then those in English. And such a marathon actually provides a very insightful experience into how chameleonic this guy's ideology actually is, and also explains quite a lot on why he has so many useful idiots for his ideological views. In short, what he says in English is not what he says in Russian, and same goes with Duginist-leaning publications. For instance, the same publication can publish entirely different positions on the exact same story depending on the language of reporting. And it works, because most people don't speak more than 1 or 2 languages, and the research for such things is costly. Anyway, the focus in understanding this ideology, which Dugin himself refuses to call Duginism, but rather prefers terms like Eurasianism or continentalism. So the key works in understanding Duginism or Eurasianism or continentalism, whatever, are these 2 books. Основы геополитики, геополитическое будущее России, or the foundations of geopolitics, the geopolitical future of Russia, and четвертая политическая теория, or the fourth political theory. Now, the first book is basically Dugin's argument as to why Russia has the right to invade and dominate most of Europe, and then after he's done explaining that, he proceeds to basically expand on Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky and lay out a very detailed plan on how to achieve Russian dominance. Now, mind you, the logic is not to have Russia everywhere, but rather to have as many countries as possible play by the music of Russia. The maximum task of the future is the Finlandization of all of Europe, Dugin states in Osnovy Geopolitiki. Now, Finlandization is basically the term by which a larger neighboring country de facto dominates the foreign affairs of a smaller country, whilst that country maintains some sort of independence and a national political system. Now, the term originates, as the name suggests, with the politics of Finland, is particularly the politics of Finland after World War II, when the Soviet Union did not annex the entirety of Finland, but nevertheless got to keep Finland in a state of limbo, neither in the Western Bloc nor in the Eastern Bloc, and generally defenseless and at the mercy and the whims of the Soviet Union. Now, this book, written all the way back in 1997, lays out a very detailed plan of Russian subversion to be developed not just in Europe but also in the United States, China, the Caucasus area, Japan, and so on and so forth. And some of the objectives of Duginist subversion have already been achieved or may indeed be achieved sooner than many would dare to think. Let me read a few passages from page 367 from the Foundations of Geopolitics by Aleksandr Dugin. Quote, "All levels of geopolitical pressure must be activated simultaneously. It is especially important to introduce geopolitical disorder into internal American activity, encouraging all kinds of separatism and ethnic, social, and racial conflicts, actively supporting all dissident movements, extremist, racist, and sectarian groups, thus destabilizing internal political process in the United States. It would also make sense simultaneously to support isolationist tendencies in American politics." Now, on page 248, the same book, Dugin writes, quote, "It is important to provoke all forms of instability and separatism within the borders of the United States. It is possible to make use of the political forces of Afro-American racists." Close quote. Now, are you scared yet? Because there's more, as in a lot more. Page 216, on the construction of the Eurasian Empire. Quote, "At the basis of the geopolitical construction of this Eurasian Empire, there must be placed one fundamental principle, the principle of a common enemy. A negation of Atlanticism, a repudiation of the strategic control of the United States, and the rejection of the supremacy of economic liberal market values. This represents the common civilizational basis, the common impulse which will prepare the way for a strong political and strategic union." Close quote. So basically, the Eurasian Empire is basically the union of America haters. Now that sounds lovely. Now, this is the man who, in mid-1990s, when he was writing this book, was also the main agitator for an organization called the National Bolshevik Party, an informal fascist organization that managed to get its own members of parliament, no less, in internal Russian politics. Now, this organization, the National Bolshevik Party, eventually did split along the lines of Putin-loving. So Dugin was on the Putin-loving splinter group, which now no longer uses the name National Bolshevik Party, but rather calls itself the neo-Eurasian movement. It's funny because this is a case of ideological subversion that is plainly obvious and honest, Yet you are called a conspiracist whenever you talk about it. Anyway, back to Dugin's books. Dugin's Plan for Europe, page 369, quote, "The task of Moscow is to tear Europe away from the control of the United States, to assist European unification, and to strengthen ties with Central Europe under the aegis of the fundamental external axis Moscow-Berlin. Eurasia needs a united, friendly Europe." And in pages 251 to 252, Dugin had already clarified that the goal is a, quote, supranational empire in which ethnic Russians would, quote, occupy a privileged position, close quote. Now, if you think that resembles the Soviet Union, you would of course be correct, and Dugin himself is very open about it and admits it one page later at page 253, where he notes that his ethnic model is quite similar with the Soviet Union. And by quite similar, we will be excused if we presume to mean identical, since I have yet to see anything in Dugin's visions of the future that does not lead to gulags and extreme poverty by means of socialism. Now, needless to say, Duginism is inherently anti-capitalist, but that's hardly a surprise for one of the founding members of the National Bolshevik Party, isn't it? Anyway, enough with this book, let's go to the other book that is relevant to understanding Duginism, Четвертая политическая теория, or the fourth political theory. Now, this book is published in 2012, when Dugin was already an advisor for the Kremlin, and it is 15 years after the overt totalitarianism of mid-1990s. Now, I would dare to say that by the time he started writing the fourth political theory, Dugin himself became more, let's say, intellectually disciplined, and also a lot more aware of the fact that you can't just go to the world and say, "Hello chaps, I'm here with the Eurasian Empire. Hey there Germany, we'll give you Kaliningrad back in exchange for your Finlandization. What do you think about that? Oh, and by the way, you can have Estonia as part of your influence as long as you play nice with France." I mean, he must have realized somewhere along these years that selling such radical ideas is a lot more of a complex process, and bluntness is not one of them. Now, in the intro, I compared Duginism with cultural Marxism for the simple reason that it follows the exact same path. It started out as a splinter group of the Bolsheviks and then gradually refining itself to become more subversive and a lot less open about its goals. Now, if you remember, the Frankfurt School outright refused to call its institution the Institute for Marxism, but rather opted for a more vague term of Institute for Social Research. Same goes with Duginism. You see, it's not Duginism, but it's continentalism, which is opposed to Atlanticism, and it's not about creating a Russian empire, but about a united and friendly Europe. See how this goes? Now, as a result of this, let's say, increased discipline from Dugin, the fourth political theory starts out from a less insane premise, so to speak. So it starts with the introduction called "To Be or Not to Be." Now let me read you a bit from it, with the note that I read the book originally in Russian, and this is not my translation. My translation. So, from the introduction of the fourth political theory, quote, "For our country," Russia that is, "the fourth political theory has, in addition to everything else, a large practical significance. The majority of Russians suffer integration into the global community dramatically, like a deprivation of their identity. The liberal ideology in the 1990s was almost entirely rejected by the populace. But together with that, it is intuitively understandable that the appeal to the illiberal political ideologies of the 20th century, to communism and fascism in our society, is unlikely, since those very ideologies already proved themselves historically as failures in opposition to liberalism, to say nothing of the moral costs of totalitarianism. Therefore, in order to fill the void, Russia needs a new political idea. Liberalism does not fit, but communism and fascism are unacceptable. Consequently, we need a fourth political theory. And if for someone this is a question of free choice, the realization of political will, which can always be directed both to an assertion and its negation, then for Russia this is a question of life and death, a Hamlet-like question. If Russia selects to be, then this automatically signifies the creation of a fourth political theory. In the opposite case, there remains not to be and quietly leave the historical arena to dissolve into the global world, neither brought into being nor directed by us. Now, this is a far more sophisticated argument for Russian imperialism than what we have read in the Foundations of Geopolitics. For starters, it proclaims to denounce totalitarianism, while in the 1990s Dugin was an open fan of it, and then frames the issue into an existential one, namely that if Russians don't build an empire fast, they will simply die out as a civilization and as a people. And here I should probably note that Dugin views Russia as a distinct and different civilization from the rest of Europe. Now, I will refrain from criticism for now. I'll leave that for the second and third part of this video. So, further in the introduction, Dugin explains that liberalism is the first political theory, communism is the second political theory, and fascism is the third political theory, and he then launches into a critique of liberalism after swiftly dismissing fascism as having died in its youth, his words, not mine, and communism as having died of decrepitude. Now, mind you, Dugin takes a rather holistic view of ideologies. For instance, he sees Mussolini's fascism as just an offshoot of fascism as a political theory that merely competed with Hitler's National Socialism or Franco's National Syndicalism. The same way he describes Soviet communism as merely one of the branches of communism coexisting with other forms of communism such as North Korean Juche or European social democracy. And he's not wrong in that regard. He also describes liberalism as existing both as a left-wing flavor and a right-wing flavor. His critique of liberalism, however, is what persuades a lot of people to adopt elements of Duginist thinking without even realizing it. Now that's the part of Duginism that makes it so dangerous and also similar to cultural Marxism, which has become so entrenched that even hardline cultural Marxist activists don't even know where their ideas come from. By these kinds of mind games, Duginism attempts to accomplish basically the same thing. Now, mind you, the term itself, mind games, comes from Dugin's own website called 4pt.su. Now, 4pt for the fourth political theory and SU from, the Soviet Union. Anyway, before reading from Dugin's Soviet website, let's read some more from the fourth political theory. So, Dugin on Liberalism, the fourth political theory, chapter 1, very long quote, here it goes. The end of liberalism and post-liberalism. It happened that the victory of liberalism, the first political theory, coincided with its end. But this paradox is only apparent. Liberalism initially showed itself forth as an ideology, not as dogmatic as Marxism, but no less philosophical, well-built and precise. It was ideologically opposed to Marxism and fascism, waging with them not only a technological war for survival, but also defending its right to a monopolistic formation of the way of the future. While other concurrent ideologies were alive, liberalism remained and grew stronger, particularly as an ideology, that is, a totality of ideas, opinions, and projections peculiar to a historical subject. Each of the three political theories had its own subject. The subject of communism was the class, the subject of fascism was the state in the Italian fascism of Mussolini, or the race in Hitler's National Socialism. In liberalism, the subject was the individual, freed from all forms of collective identity, from all kinds of attachment, or l'appartenance. Now here's Dugin acknowledging being influenced by Alain Benoit, a French ideologue who actually admired Antonio Gramsci, that is, a cultural Marxist, and Jean Baudrillard, also a cultural Marxist, yet who is for some reason thought to be conservative. Now, are you confused yet? Hold on, there's more, and the more we progress, the more intentional the confusion gets. Anyway, confusion is the main tactic of Duginism, so back to the book. Where were we? Yeah, here. Quote, while the ideological fight had formal antagonists, entire narodi being the Russian word for peoples, and societies, at least theoretically, could select which subject to address themselves to. So the class-based, the racial, statist, or the individual. The victory of liberalism answered that question. The normative subject at the limits of all humanity became the individual. And soon appears the phenomenon of globalization, the model of a post-industrial society, the beginning of the epoch of postmodernity. From now on, the individual subject is no more the result of a choice, but some kind of compulsory given. A man is freed from attachments. The ideology of human rights becomes standard, at least in theory, and in fact compulsory. Mankind, composed of individuals, is naturally drawn to universalism, becomes global and integrated. Thus is born the project of world government and world rule, or globalism. The new level of technological development allows people to reach independence from the class structures of industrial societies, namely post-industrialism. The values of rationalism, science, and positivism are recognized as disguised form of totalitarian repressive strategies, i.e. big narratives, and are thus exposed to criticism with a parallel glorification of complete freedom and independence of individual from any restraining factors, for that matter from reason, morality, identities, social, ethnic, or even gender, discipline, and so on and so forth. Basically, postmodernism. At this stage, liberalism stops being the first political theory but becomes the only political practice. The end of history comes, politics is replaced by economics, by the global market, governments and nations are drawn into the melting pot of world globalization. Having won, liberalism disappears, transforming into something entirely different, post-liberalism. It no longer has a political dimension, it is not a matter of free choice but becomes a peculiar kind of fate, from which comes the thesis of post-industrial society, the economics of fate. Now, of course, the only problem is that this is not a critique of liberalism. Dugin is, of course, correct when he criticizes the excesses of modernity, but he misattributes this criticism to liberalism. There's nothing in the liberal tradition preventing people from associating. Actually, quite the opposite. Classical liberalism, which Dugin thinks it's the first political theory and the one that won the war for modernity. Well, classical liberalism actually absolutely insists on the natural right to free association. It is the leftist tradition that opposes free association, or at the very least seeks to include caveats to that right. A classical liberal thinks that on your own property, as well as on legitimately operated property, one is free to associate with whomever one wants. A leftist, however, thinks that one is free to associate with whomever one wants, provided that one chooses to include everyone as long as one is white. So, a white students' union is perfectly legitimate in a classical liberal framework, whereas in a leftist framework, such thing is verboten. As we will see throughout this video, Dugin does this multiple times. He presents a valid criticism of something and then lays the blame on America, on liberalism, on capitalism, or on modernity in general, and he does that regardless of whether that is indeed the case or not. And as he laid out in his book The Foundations of Geopolitics, he's doing it intentionally, following the credo that the United States and what it stands for must be the scapegoat. In fact, it would be mistaken to assume that Dugin is simply committing an honest mistake. Dugin may have a highly dangerous and apocalyptic ideology, but he is not stupid. Dismissing him and his ideas as just a lunatic fringe is what got us into this mess to begin with. He is not stupid. He knows what he's doing and he knows it full well. A good exemplification of the fact that Dugin knows what he's doing is the 13th chapter of the book called Gender in the Fourth Political Theory. Now, there are a few reasons for which I insist to read from this chapter. It basically reads like a Tumblr post and should thus be mandatory reading for all those real men who troll various places praising Putin and implicitly Dugin. So, chapter 13, the fourth political theory, pages 107 and 108, longish quote, here it goes. How does gender change under the conditions of postmodernity? The postmodern represents a combination of all three political theories. On the one hand, this is an accomplished modernity which has reached its logical end as hypermodern or ultramodern. Thus, all three political theories project onto postmodernity their own gender archetypes, which represented the limits of their own structures. These limits are expressed through an institutionalization of gender in postmodernity. What is the postmodern gender? It is a maximization of the liberal man, the archetype of which applies to all of its antitheses, the stupid, the poor, the non-white, the little, and so forth. It is also the gender of globalization, when the properties of a certain type are extended as social standards onto all other types as universalism. Hence the idea that the proletarians are only the bourgeoisie who have not grown rich yet. Blacks are unmodernized whites, and women are not yet fully liberated men. That is, we see that this all-consuming archetype becomes meaningless. The re-extension of existing gender models can lead to the explosion of the hypermodern like a rotting fungus, and its gender archetypes will fail. Now we are in this moment of a postmodern re-extension and the final breaking of gender. The stages of this break are feminism, homosexuality, sex change operations, and transhumanity. In the West, the second political theory had a great influence on the elites, particularly the creative professions, actors, writers, philosophers, etc. And this is the desiring machine incorporating leftist feminism with its ideas of freedom from sex. Donna Haraway is such a feminist, or rather loosely a neo-Marxist and a postmodernist. She argued that while the mature woman may feel an urge to be liberated, liberation in our culture involves definition of the opposite. Therefore, it is necessary to overcome both the man and the woman through becoming a cyborg. According to her, sex can be overcome only by having overcome being human. In a similar vein is Foucault's conception of sexuality, that is, sexuality prior to sex as a neutral dispositive. Sexuality spreading along the surface of the screen, the body without organs. This pansexuality, which is a smooth surface of sexual arousals, remains unclear in terms of from whom it is derived, for what reason, and most importantly, no matter in what orientation or direction. As a whole, in terms of the erosion and destruction of the gender constructions of modernity, Marxist thought introduces the most significant contribution. Elements of fascism in postmodernity are represented by the practice of BDSM. Contemporary fascism contains strong elements of sadomasochism, and perverted fascism is an essential attribute of postmodernism, along with feminism, cyborgs, and a body without organs, and so on. Eventually, we find ourselves in an interesting situation. The predominant gender of modernity is expressed as a re-extension of its original conception, is fast eroding, and in some instances is about to explode, or perhaps has already exploded. We stand on a transition between the hypermodern and the postmodern, and we do not know where the truth and where the reality lies. So in a postmodern construction of gender, there will not be any men. Let us imagine the situation. The archetype of the man falls into pieces which do not constitute parts of the whole anymore, but symbolize only themselves. Conservative forces can stand up for this archetype, demand the return of masculinity, this reasonable, wealthy white person, but thereby they only try to continue modernity through gender reconstructions. This position seems homeless, and here again the fourth political theory, in our opinion, goes forward. we suggest taking a step towards gender as a design, despite the notorious representations of endoprobium that we will cause. By going beyond the limits of gender, which we know, we get to the domain of uncertainty, androgyny, and sex as practiced by the angels. In the same sphere, it is necessary to search for a gender of the fourth political theory, namely by taking risks in looking behind the limits of the collapsed chimera of modernity. We can as yet provide only outlines. We know that it is the gender of design and trajectory, that this gender represents a root reality, that it belongs to l'imaginaire. By extending our investigation, we can raise the question about the gender of the radical self, which is beyond the basic paradigms. So basically, Aleksandr Dugin doesn't fundamentally disagree with what we routinely call gender abolitionist feminists. That would be the most cancerous form of genderist ideology that is currently on its way to catching roots in the academe, provided there will still be an academe for them by the time they succeed, but that's a different story. So again, we see Dugin presenting a decent enough description of the status quo and a valid criticism of how things are done, but then intentionally putting the blame somewhere else or simply ignoring it. In this case, he simply ignores and takes the situation as is, and it makes sense for him to do so. I mean, think about it from his perspective, namely the totalitarian perspective. If you want to create an empire with Russia at its center based on Finlandization, now do you want strong families and especially strong men in your buffer territories or in the territories of your enemy? Of course not. You want them to be as weak as possible, so tolerating genderist madness is actually to your advantage. Now, let that sink in for all those alt-right keyboard warriors who claim to oppose degeneracy but then sing praises to Putin and invite Dugin at their own conferences. Alright, one more quote and then we get to the second part of this video. Told you this is long. Now, while in practice, as we will see in a few minutes, Duginism has sought to infiltrate conservatism, especially the specific sub-brands of European conservatism, who tend to have a more favorable view of the maximal state compared to the fringes of the American conservative movement. Dugin himself explicitly says in his book what critics of Duginism have been trying to explain to naive souls for years now. Duginism is not conservative. Here, chapter 4, The Reversibility of Time, page 38, quote, "The fourth political theory constructs and reconstructs society behind modern axioms. That is why the elements of the different political forms can be used in the fourth political theory without any connection to the time scale. There are no stages and epochs, but only preconcepts and concepts. In this context, theological constructions, antiquity, caste, and other aspects of traditional society are only some of the possible variants, along with socialism, Keynesian theory, free markets, parliamentary democracy, or quote-unquote nationalism. They are simply forms, but they would not be related to an implied topography of objective historical time. There is no such thing. If time is historical, it is cannot objective. Dasein says the same. Dasein is the subject of the fourth political theory. Now, Dasein can be recovered by the refinement of the existential truth derived from the ontological superstructure of society. Dasein is something that institutionalizes time. Durand institutionalizes time by trajectum in his topography. Now, trajectum or Dasein is not a function of time, but time is a function of trajectum or Dasein. This is why time is something that is institutionalized by politics in the context of fourth political theory. Time is a political category. Political time is a preconcept of a political form. The fourth political theory has opened a unique perspective. If we comprehend the principle of the reversibility of time, we are not only able to compose the project of a future society, but we will also be able to compose a whole range of projects of different future societies. Thus, we would be able to suggest some non-linear strategies for a new institutionalization of the world. The fourth political theory is not an invitation to a return to traditional society, i.e., it is not conservatism in the conventional sense. There are many characteristics of our chronological past which are pleasant and many which are not. Similarly, the forms of traditional society can also be distinguished from each other. Finally, the ethnic and sociological matrices and the contexts of different contemporary societies are also different from each other. Therefore, the fourth political theory should not impose anything on anyone. Adherents of the fourth political theory should act step by step. If we simply argue the reversibility of time and Dasein as the subjects of our theory, that would be the first and primary step. We would thus free ourselves to develop the preconcepts. We can define several preconcepts with regards to the reversibility of time and Dasein or Trajectum, and therefore we can define several political concepts of time, and each of them can be plugged into the current political project according to the principles of the fourth political theory. Now, translation from all of that longish thingy. Basically, forget about history, we'll do whatever it takes to build Eurasia. If the current political project, as Dugin puts it, requires us to be conservative, we'll be conservative and move forward. But if the current political project requires us to be revolutionary Marxists, then we'll swiftly become revolutionary Marxists for the purpose of that project. That's how it was logically consistent for Dugin and most of his followers for him to personally go and spread his ideas amongst the revolutionary Marxists in Greece. For instance, in 2013, Nikos Koutsias, now Minister of Foreign Affairs in Alexis Tsipras' cabinet, invited Dugin to deliver a lecture titled International Politics and the Eurasianist Vision on the 12th of April at the University of Piraeus, where Koutsias held a post of Professor of Political Theories. Now, in that lecture, Dugin implicitly suggested that rather than leaving the EU and joining the Russia-led Eurasian Union, Greece should remain in the EU to promote the pro-Russian vision of international politics. The same day, Dugin presented his lecture, The Geopolitics of Russia, at the Pantheon University, a lecture hosted by Konstantinos Filis, research director of the Institute of International Relations at the Pantheon University. Now, Dugin, during his visit to Greece, Dugin also met with Syriza's members Dimitris Konstantakopoulos, a man who was a correspondent for the Athens News Agency in Moscow between 1989 and 1999. That would be the period when Dugin was making waves with his national Bolshevik movement. Dugin interviewed Konstantakopoulos, and Konstantakopoulos interviewed him back. Now, Dugin published his interview for his followers, and Konstantakopoulos published his interview for the far-left fans of Syriza. Now, isn't that lovely? Now, soon after this tour in Greece, Aleksandr Dugin was writing on the internet. Let me read you that quote. In Greece, our partners could eventually be leftists from Syriza, which refuses Atlanticism, liberalism, and the domination of the forces of global finance. As far as I know, Syriza is anti-capitalist, and it is crucial of the global oligarchy that has victimized Greece and Cyprus. The case of Syriza is interesting because of its far-left attitude towards the global system. It is a good sign that such non-conformist forces have appeared on the scene. Dimitris Konstantakopoulos writes excellent articles, and his strategic analysis I find very correct and profound in many cases. Now, translation from Dugin talk to normal talk. For the purposes of this political project, namely getting Greece closer to Eurasianism, the fans of the fourth political theory have to be revolutionary Marxists. Are you confused yet? Now get ready for more confusion as we transition to the second part of this video. Now, having a somewhat decent idea of what Duginism is, now we can slowly start analyzing how it works in practice. Now, thankfully, Dugin is less and less secretive on how he intends to broadcast his ideology and subvert other societies. Even though he claims to hate modern communication, he has no qualms in using it. The best sources for how Duginism works in practice are his own website, 4pt.su, and also the collective blog katehon.com. Now, katehon.com is basically Duginism Central Incorporated. It might as well be called Duginism.com, since it is basically a collection of Duginist strategies and Duginist take on current events. Now, it is interesting to note that Katehon is a lot more ideologically consistent than Dugin's own website, 4pt.su, on which Dugin actually publicizes articles that are critical of him, but more on that later. So, Katehon.com is a website led by Dugin himself and the Russian oligarch Konstantin Malofeev, a chap who financed the allegedly local and volunteer troops in Ukraine, an action which got him on the sanctions list imposed on Putin's close people. But Malofeev is a lot more than that. Malofeev is basically Aleksandr Dugin's bank. He is, if you want, the Georg Soros of Russia. Now, just like there are hardly any cultural Marxist groups that are not funded by Soros, the same is true with Duginist groups. There are hardly any Duginist groups in Europe that are not funded somehow by Malofeev. And mind you, Duginist groups don't necessarily mean pro-Russian political parties. As Dugin himself laid out in his book, Duginism can and indeed should be disseminated by any means necessary depending on the, you guessed it, current political project. For example, a significant chunk of the pro-life movement, or the anti-abortion movement if you prefer, in my country, in Romania, is actually funded by Malofeev. And the boots-on-the-ground activists don't even know that. And they don't have to. All they have to know is that Russia stands against abortion, a mantra that is routinely believed now in so many conservative circles, in spite of the fact that it's outright false. Now, there are more abortions per capita in Russia than anywhere in Europe, but this probably belongs in a future video that will be called Why Russia Isn't Great. Anyway, the point is that this chap, Malofeev, is with the money. Dugin is with the leadership and the politics on Katehon. Now, Malofeev, by the way, is also the president of the Saint Basil the Great Foundation, which is sanctioned by the Muscovite Patriarchate. And the Muscovite Patriarch is a former KGB agent. Now, isn't that lovely? This is the challenge, basically, in this video. I don't want to go too much on a tangent, but there are just too many things to explore when it comes to practical Duginism, and we could spend 5 hours just listing all the connections. For instance, here's another one. While Malofeev is presented to naive pro-lifers and soon-to-be useful idiots for Duginist subversion as a man of the church, Dugin has expressed explicit disdain for the church for its refusal to adopt the occult and Satanism, or for trying to adapt pre-Christian concepts. Also, while in 2002 the Russian Orthodox Church declared his views as heretical, most of those clergymen are either dead or have subsequently been expelled from the church, and now Dugin actually makes regular appearances at the church's TV station with Ilarion Alfeev, the second in command after Patriarch Kirill within the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, I'm sure that's just a coincidence, and the church simply changed its mind so radically in just 10 years, and certainly it has nothing to do with Putin's regime intervening in the church in 2010 and 2011. And the sad part is that many of these connections are not known widely, not because they are a secret, but because exposing them would mean translating thousands upon thousands of pages and texts and documents from Russian, and also numerous hours of interviews. I mean, it took me months to do the research for this video, and all I had to do was to read and watch videos, and translating everything would take probably years just to get everything in English till present day. Anyway, to make this as short as possible, let's read a fragment of a recent article from Katehon in which Dugin provides some tactical advice on how to spread Duginism in Eastern Europe, a region in which he acknowledges that it is a lot harder to sell the love of Russia because, well, let's just say that having people around remembering seeing their relatives shred into pieces by Russian tanks tends to have an effect. Anyway, the article is without author, which is standard operating procedure when the admin, Dugin that is, posts something. So, geopolitics of Eastern Europe, some propositions for Heartland. Now, the article is very long, so I'll start from somewhere in the middle and skip multiple parts for time constraints reasons. Links are, of course, in the low bar. So, quote, NATO has demonstrated its presence in Eastern Europe and strengthened its military component. There are plans to place additional troops in Eastern Europe. In particular, this applies to Poland, Romania, and the Baltic countries. Since April of last year, a set of military exercises have been performed within the framework of the implementation of Operation Atlantic Resolve. The exercises won't finish for a year. They are taking place in Eastern Europe, primarily in the Baltic states, as well as in Romania and Poland, and also the partially affected Czech Republic. Maneuvers are also taking place in the Baltic and Black Seas. The objectives of these activities are, as a show of force, to demonstrate NATO's presence in the region, the strengthening of military technical cooperation between the alliance countries, and to improve the quality of interaction between the respective armed services of the Americans and their Western and Eastern European allies. The key countries here are the Baltic states, Poland and Romania. It should be mentioned that in addition to military exercises in these countries, there was an increase in the amount of anti-Russian hysteria in the region, even including arrests and searches of those who dared to have an independent position on their country's foreign policies. The most remarkable were cases of Lithuanian nationalists who were blamed for publishing Aleksandr Dugin's texts on their website. The unusual and untimely death of Vlad Hoxha, the young leader of the United Romania Party in December 2014, can be compared with the similarly strange death of Andrei Leper in August 2011, the leader of the right-wing populist party Self-Defense in Poland. These illustrate how being part of the opposition in Eastern Europe can cost you your life. Why is so much attention being paid to the Baltic states, Poland and Romania? Firstly, there is a purely geographical reason. The Baltic states, Poland, the Ukraine and Romania lock in Russia, separating it from Central Europe and especially Germany. With the participation of these countries, a cordon sanitaire stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea can be built perfectly. To accomplish these countries are enough. Two of these countries, Poland and Romania, are the largest in the Eastern EU in area and population and have the most military potential in the region. The Polish population is 38,346,279 and its active personnel number 130,000. For Romania, these figures are 21,730,000 and 73,000. For comparison, the Hungarian army numbers only 29,000 and Serbia has only 20,000. Both countries, Romania and Poland, have their own military industry, and Poland has over 500,000 reserve troops. In both countries, society's elites and the common people alike traditionally perceive their countries as outposts of Europe and the Western world as a whole and see themselves as defenders from Eastern enemies. Both countries have developed geopolitical concepts that justify eastwards expansionism. In Poland, this is a version of the old Jagiellonian idea named after the dynasty that ruled during the Rzeczpospolita. The main ideas were formulated a century ago. There are the concepts of intermarium and Prometheism, as well as the ULB, the Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, or Giedaitis Moroshevsky. Now skipping a bit. In Romania, they have their own Eastern pretensions. The country maintains claims to Moldova and Transnistria, and many support the anti-Russian concept of geopolitics of orthodoxy, which was elaborated by the Romanian geopolitical analyst Simeon Mehedinț, and based on the denial of Russia's role as leader of the Orthodox world. So for Romanian geopolitical tradition, it is crucial to insist on independent policy from Russia and the use of conservative Orthodox rhetoric against Russia. The third reason, neither of these countries were close friends of Russia or Germany, historically. This perception is based on the history of wars and submission and today's leading role of Germany in the EU. German and Austrian businesses have bought virtually all the lands, resources and industry in Romania and Poland, so the rejection of Western hegemony and TNC in these countries is often reduced to banal Germanophobia. That factor is often used by Soros and his partners, who massively penetrate all protest movements against the destruction and theft of countries' natural resources. That hijacks the reorientation of these countries and the possibility of them entering into continentalist projects. Again, skipping a bit more. What is the political situation in Eastern Europe, particularly in these two key countries? Actually, the sphere of internal politics is dominated by Atlanticist structures. Continentalists are marginalized or divided and fragmented, and the formation of new structures has stopped. That was done with the United Romania project, for example. The exceptions are Hungary, Greece, and Macedonia. The Dveri movement in Serbia has some political potential. The popularity of the Ataka party in Bulgaria is on the wane, and other anti-Atlanticist structures are marginal. Estonia and Latvia can both boast their pro-Russian parties. Center Party and Harmony are the biggest in these respective countries, but the pro-Atlanticist coalitions have relegated them to the opposition. An interesting example could be the creation of the Change Party in Poland. However, they remain marginal and they have just started their political lives. What is more interesting is that the Atlanticists use conservative rhetoric both in Poland and Romania. This strategy was used for years in Poland and is today on the rise in Romania, where they created intellectual centers and political structures that merge conservative discourse with a clearly anti-continentalist geopolitical stance. The most spectacular example is the Romanian source liniadreapta.net, which is conducted by the heirs of former communist internationalists of Jewish origin. I'm sorry for this, but I... Well, I just happen to know the guy who runs liniadreapta.net. Now, I don't always agree with him, and I wouldn't go as far as to say that I'm friends with him, but we do keep in touch since we have rather congruent interests most of the time. Now, Costin, because that's the guy's name, is many things, but a communist internationalist Jew? I mean, come on. That's insane even by Duginist standards, and it's not like he's hiding or something. I mean, one of the many Duginists who crawl the internet could very easily look him up and see for themselves. Anyway, let's read some more from this article because it really is a good article for those who want to understand practical Duginism. So, quote, the strategy, and here he refers to the strategy of criticizing Duginism from a conservative standpoint. So, the strategy can be clearly explained because conservative values are normal for 99% of Romania's population. The support of some parties that look leftist to Westerners is based on their clear support of conservative values. Smer in Slovakia and the Social Democratic Party in Romania, for example. Usually, the structures of the socially conservative, social populist ideological trend have the greatest support among movements and parties with a Euro-continentalist position. Appeals to traditional values and the sovereignty of states are finding their place in the hearts of Eastern Europeans. Skipping a bit. The region is home to the greatest number of people with positive attitudes towards the Church in Europe, as well as the largest number of people who categorize themselves as religious. Eastern Europeans are least positive about the gender values promoted by the EU. This potential can be tapped, but must be used intelligently through the ideological models addressing the real problems that concern Eastern Europeans: loss of sovereignty, economic dependence and crisis, the sale of land and resources to foreigners, and the unstable future of the European Union. In the process of implementing quotas on migrants, the problem of third world immigration could emerge, especially when this problem, an influx of migrants, is coupled with an outflow of native people from these countries. So the ideological and geopolitical models that address the real problems of Eastern Europeans should be proposed by Eurasianists and not the nostalgic Stalinist-seeming left-wing agenda. In these models, historic memories that are specific to Eastern Europeans should be evoked. For example, their image of themselves as defender of Europe and Christianity should be reoriented towards defense from liberalism, cultural Marxism, the ideology of political correctness, oligarchic capitalism, plutocracy, and the forces of global hegemony. It should be stressed that the US leadership is now taking part in an anti-European agenda. Unfortunately, attitudes towards Russia, the key country in the Eurasian project, are not positive everywhere. Whereas in most of the Balkan countries popular sentiments remain generally positive, the elite is anti-Russian or skeptical. In Poland and Romania, Russia is perceived with some anxiety, as many cling to memories of the country's troubled past. This is a problem that should be resolved. The continentalist leaders and structures in Eastern Europe should not look like the hand of Moscow. Moreover, they should not be the puppets of Moscow or Berlin. Moscow and Berlin, the trans-geographical continentalist poles, should find political forces, supposedly in the national populist camp, and think tanks that share a continentalist worldview and can be partners rather than clients. They should be oriented primarily towards their own sovereignty rather than Russophilia in and of itself. So the heartland, both European and Eurasian, must work in this direction. Now, are we clear? So, for this political project, deception is fair game. So is doublethink. So, for instance, it is a bad thing that Poles and Romanians remember the decades of Russian aggression because time is not objective, as Dugin explained in his book. But nevertheless, time is still relevant and suddenly objective if it can be used to forward the continentalist agenda, namely the Duginist agenda. Now notice the consistency in blaming the United States. This is probably the only consistent aspect of practical Duginism. So Dugin explicitly says that for the purpose of the Polish-Romanian political project, the advocates of Duginism must do everything in their power to avoid looking like the hand of Moscow, even though they are and they will be. Also notice the willingness to be purposefully confusing when Dugin says that, quote, their image of themselves as defender of Europe and Christianity should be reoriented towards defense from liberalism, cultural Marxism, the ideology of political correctness, oligarchic capitalism, plutocracy, and the forces of global hegemony. Now, this comes from a man who is funded by oligarchic capitalism, has a cultural Marxist view of sexuality, hangs around circles of plutocrats for most of the time, and aims to build Russian-centric global hegemony. I mean, you can't get more hypocritical than that, but then again, Dugin doesn't care if he is hypocritical. As he says in his book, it all depends on the current political project. In other words, hypocrisy is acceptable, or in a more traditional sense, the ends justify the means. He probably learned that as part of the National Bolshevik Party. But hey, at least he is willing to acknowledge several realities about Poland, Romania, and the Baltics. I mean, wanna know what Dugin thinks it should be done about Ukrainians? By the way, here's Dugin in a Google Hangout.
Я думаю, убивать и убивать. Больше разговоров никаких не должно быть. Как профессор, я так считаю.
But just in case he might be misrepresented, Dugin made sure to clarify his outburst on Facebook. Here's Dugin on Facebook saying, quote, Ukraine needs to be cleansed of idiots. A genocide of cretins suggests itself. Cretins who are virulent, closed for the voice of Logos, deadly, and in addition to this, extremely stupid. I don't believe that these are Ukrainians. Ukrainians are a fine Slavic people, but these are some race of bastards that emerged from the sewage. A genocide suggests itself, and the cleansing of a country is needed. I mean, this is the guy who for a while was the official policy advisor at the Kremlin and still retains to this day a disproportionate amount of influence. Yet for some reason, I am the extremist whenever I mention the not so covert and the glaringly obvious danger of Russian aggression. Anyway, let's hop on Dugin's official website, 4pt.sovietunion, and read a bit from an article written by Andrei Tolstoy and Edward McCaffrey, Mind Games, Aleksandr Dugin and Russia's War of Ideas. Now, before reading some of it, it is worth mentioning that Andrei Tolstoy, full name Andrei Tolstoy Miloslavsky, is a property developer in London who calls himself Count Tolstoy and hosts charity events like the War and Peace Ball, an event which just happens to be frequented by FSB agents. I mean, if Lev Tolstoy had been alive today, he'd be very unhappy, to say the least, of Andrei's activities. Meanwhile, Edward McCaffrey is a character of far less importance. He writes for the World Affairs Journal, a publication that is far less relevant than it pretends to be. Now, I know one-man blogs with more influence than that rag, but anyway, McCaffrey's bio on that publication says that he's a PhD candidate at Arizona State University researching the influence of new media technologies on thought, culture, and politics. So yeah, now that we know who the authors are, let's read some of their words on Dugin's website, 4pt.sovietunion. Quote, Aleksandr Dugin, the Russian philosopher and political activist, has attracted sporadic coverage in English-language publications over the past year. He is an engaging figure, prolific, radical, bearded, equally at home in university seminars, and posing with tanks in South Ossetia and eastern Ukraine. So adept at self-promotion that he is sometimes not taken as seriously as he should be. Dugin is the intellectual who has Vladimir Putin's back in the emerging ideological conflict between Russia and the West. At home, Putin uses him to create a nationalist anti-liberal voting bloc, whilst abroad, Dugin is the linchpin of numerous irregular networks of anti-liberal political resistance and sabotage. No individual better represents the tactics of the current Russian regime. Dugin's rise has been partly camouflaged by an intellectual biography that is complex and at times contradictory. An anti-communist in the 1980s, he worked closely with the remnants of the Communist Party after the fall of the Soviet Union. In mid-1990s, he became involved with National Bolshevism, a group of political parties that openly espoused the combination of communist economics and radical Russian nationalism. He has praised Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union whilst also supporting family and religious values. Since the late 1990s, Dugin has organized his views into a geostrategic ideology and the complex political metaphysics known respectively as neo-Eurasianism and the Fourth Political Theory. The former posits an ongoing archetypal clash between land and maritime civilizations and holds that there is a struggle between, on the one hand, harmonious land-based societies organized around history and tradition, and on the other hand, inherently liberal Atlanticist empires of the sea whose capitalistic drives abhors and undermines tradition. Skipping a bit, Dugin's solution is for Eurasia to consciously become a Großraum, great space in German, and analogous in scope to the Atlanticist world. Within this Großraum, Dugin proposes a complex distribution of power between a strategic center and various subdivisions based on culture and history known as autonomies. This center is responsible for basic economic and military coordination between the autonomies, which are otherwise left to organize their internal affairs in accordance with their own unique traditions. Thus, there is a room for a range of different political, economic, and social systems, though it seems clear that Dugin imagines most will adopt a basically conservative and corporatist structure. Dugin's fourth political theory is based on the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, who argued that modernity is a kind of scientific objectification of the world which only accepts cultural or traditional knowledge as long as it remains secondary to any objective inquiry. According to Dugin, this paradigm is fundamental to three of the most powerful political philosophies of modernity: Marxism, fascism, and liberalism. As a self-professed Eurasianist, he rejects all three but believes that these ideologies still contain some useful elements out of which he constructs their successor, the fourth political theory. This theory does not base its understanding of history on class, race, or the individual, but on Dasein, Heidegger's term for humanity. Dugin's goal is to cultivate a Eurasian socio-political network to rival its American-dominated Atlanticist counterpart. The nodes of this network are diverse and numerous, aimed at exploiting the shadow side of liberal institutions and technologies. One of them is the Russian system of higher education. Dugin is a professor in the sociology department of Russia's flagship Moscow State University, where the list of courses he offers, mainly on geopolitics, philosophy, and the history of science, far outnumbers that of any colleague. He has also founded the Center for Conservative Studies, which converts academics around the country to his agenda. Dugin also lectures at the country's interior ministry, i.e. the police, the academies, military schools, and other law enforcement institutions. These lectures are also available online, and in them he presents an Atlanticist versus Eurasianist perspective instructing Russia's guardians of public order about the nature of the liberal Atlanticist propaganda against which they must be immunized. A prolific writer who has authored dozens of monographs and hundreds of essays, Dugin tours the country and the world lecturing on political philosophy. His objective is to attract like-minded thinkers from the international fringe, involving them in debates and panels that imitate the mainstream discourse that shuns and excludes them. He has been an influence on the so-called New Right of Europe, including such parties as Germany's National Democratic Party, the British National Party, Greece's Golden Dawn, Hungary's Jobbik, and France's National Front. Dugin's ideas are given added reach by a group called the Eurasia Youth Union, headquartered in Moscow, which broadcasts news and analysis via a website in Russian, English, Romanian, Serbian, and Ukrainian. The EYU has also supplied manpower for the separatist movement in Ukraine, its members fighting there under the banners of various Russophile armed groups. Dugin has also been actively involved in the politics of Russia's elite, serving as an advisor to State Duma chairman and key Putin ally Sergei Naryshkin. His disciple Ivan Deminov serves on the ideology directorate of Putin's United Russia Party, whilst Mikhail Leontiev, allegedly Putin's favorite journalist, is a founding member of Dugin's own Eurasia Party. While claiming to be suspicious of the liberalizing effects of modern communication technology, Dugin utilizes it adroitly for his own objectives. Numerous websites that can be traced to him and his allies constantly cross-reference each other. For instance, 4pt.su, which is devoted to the fourth political theory, and Evrasia.org, which hosts neo-Eurasianist content, creating a sort of feedback loop in cyberspace that rivals mainstream news and social networks, and serves as an aggregator for political outcasts. Despite Dugin's professed anti-racism, one of the consistent pathways to his area of the internet is through American white supremacist media. He doesn't denounce them because his tactics favor the empowerment of destabilizing agents everywhere, so long as their common enemy is the liberal order. With its ad hoc, often anti-intellectual worldview in which the manufactured fact is no less robust than the real one, the internet is the perfect medium for Duginism. In particular, he has exploited the mechanism of instantaneous publishing on the internet to retract or disassociate himself from controversial claims without harming their ability to propagate. In a notorious incident on his social network page, he posted the fabricated story of a Russian-speaking boy allegedly crucified in Ukraine by pro-Western militants and released a video in which he declared that the time had come to retaliate and kill, flashing his academic credentials. He added soberly, "I say this to you as a professor." After an outraged petition condemning the story and the statement was started on change.org, Moscow State University terminated Dugin's contract but almost immediately retracted its decision, blaming it on a clerical error. Dugin removed the story from his social network page, but by that point it had gone viral amongst Russia's pro-war groups and achieved status as a nationalist war cry. Now, Dugin thought that this is an interesting enough article to repost on his own website. In fact, 4pt.su hosts quite a lot of content that is either neutral or even mildly critical of Duginism. But there is a common bond between all those apparently contradictory articles. None of them are wrong from a Duginist standpoint. That is to say, whilst I, as a critic of Duginism, regard an article that details Dugin's tactics as a critical one, Dugin himself doesn't mind that as long as it is useful. And it is useful since Dugin himself has no problem in writing about his tactics, although he is a lot more cautious with what he allows to escape in English. That is how he attracted his fans, by avoiding the parts about Finlandization, the parts about the parts of Muscovite subversion, or other parts that would lower his chances of becoming popular, even amongst the very fringes of society. Because make no mistake, while it is true that Dugin is popular amongst the extremists of both the left and especially the right, there is still a struggle within these circles. So, for instance, whilst the National Policy Institute, which is an alt-right and white nationalist think tank from Arlington, Virginia, so while NPI fully endorses Dugin by publishing his books in English, by sponsoring his appearances at conferences, such as the 2014 European Identitarian Conference in Budapest, and so on and so forth, other similar organizations stay neutral or are outright hostile to Dugin. For instance, the American Renaissance, also an alt-right and white nationalist think tank, bounces between neutrality and hostility towards Dugin. For example, an article published by American Renaissance in August 2015 titled "Why I Am a Race Realist" contains the following paragraph, quote, "When some people answer the question, 'How did you come to these beliefs?' they may be tempted to wax philosophical, delve into metaphysics, or quote Houston Stewart Chamberlain. But tying white identity to opaque interpretations of René Guénon or Aleksandr Dugin is the right-wing version of liberals who insist on tying white identity to Republican warmongering. It overlooks basic truths in favor of academic theories." Close quote. On the other hand, in 2014, AmRen did feature a Duginist at their conference, but the speaker didn't get into that at all. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all of these things is because sooner rather than later, those of us on the non-leftist spectrum will have to start being a lot more vigilant when it comes to subversion. And the task isn't easy, since the mainstream right has so far done a very, 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 very poor job at combating Duginism. I mean, heck, the most mainstream, if you can call it that way, takedown of Dugin was by a chap named Robert Zubrin at the National Review. Now, I will leave the link in the low bar, but his coverage is absolutely hysterical. I mean, I'm not saying he's necessarily wrong, though calling Dugin a Nazi is wrong per se, since your average Nazi ideologue was less radical than Dugin, but I am saying that if that is the best the mainstream right can do about Dugin, and so far it kinda does seem that way, then the mainstream right really is the utter garbage that the alt-righters make it to be. On the other hand, the alt-righters need to be more consistent with themselves, and that's all it takes to reject Duginism. I mean, heck, a Google search for Duginism comes with the first result of a rather decent alt-right blog deconstructing Duginism and explaining why this ideology is not needed, regardless of one's goals within the alt-right. But for the rest of us, who are neither part of the mainstream right nor part of the white nationalist alt-right, but who are nonetheless opposed to the normative leftism of the contemporary West, we also need to get our act together. And so we get to the third and final part of this video, why it matters. I told you this is going to be long. So, there are a plethora of reasons for which combating Duginism matters for any thinking person, including, but not limited to, the fact that totalitarian ideological subversion is not and cannot be a good thing, regardless of who does it. However, we also do face another problem. Opposition to Duginism has also been picked up by the mainstream left, and as it always happens when a good idea is picked up by the left, they destroyed it. And the damage, whilst not irreparable, is indeed quite significant. For instance, the left, even the parts of the left who fully grasp the dangers of Duginism specifically, have entirely conflated Putin with Aleksandr Dugin and started casually throwing around terms like Putinism in so many instances where such a term was wholly inappropriate. More to the point, the anti-Duginist left unwittingly helped spread Duginism through their policies. Pegida in Germany, for instance, is a largely Duginist organization now. But would Pegida even exist without Angela Merkel's disastrous policies? The answer is a resounding no. At best, Pegida would struggle at the very fringes of the society, alongside with the NDP, which is the actual Nazi party in Germany, by the way, and that would be it. But Pegida has become a lot bigger than it should have become, precisely because Merkel insisted on proving them right on one point, namely that importing 1 million fighting-age Muslim men is a recipe for disaster. And instead of fixing that, the establishment left is complaining about the rise of nationalist and populist forces, and in Germany they send the police in people's homes or the police to beat up Pegida protesters. That is not helping. That actually creates new Duginist activists who, again, don't really have to know they're spreading Duginism. In fact, I've already encountered a few decent, honest folks who are spreading around Duginist memes and who are genuinely surprised to learn that Dugin even exists. A few more years of such a disaster and a few more years of gradual, calculated deception funded by Russian oligarchs, including in the church, and we will have a huge problem on the right and in society in general. I mean, strictly on politics, we will end up in the situation where leftists are, where so many leftists propagate cultural Marxism without even knowing, because cultural Marxism has crept to the level of, well, come on, it's just what people believe. Same might indeed happen on the right with Duginism, and in many cases it has already happened with certain issues. Now, I could be very rich if I had $1 for every individual who tried to explain to me what's really happening in Ukraine and then proceeded to serve me the Duginist view on Ukraine, which has virtually nothing to do with reality. I mean, heck, there are Lorbertarians, starting with the Lorbertarian-in-chief, that is Ron Paul, who genuinely believe that the Russian-backed tanks on the street referendum in Crimea was actually a legitimate democratic act. And they're very staunch in their belief in this fiction. No amount of evidence, such as the fact that the referendum was deemed to be fair by a panel of formed exclusively by Duginists, no amount of evidence of this will convince them. Also, the people who believe Duginist narratives about Ukraine also tend to be the exact same people who know virtually nothing else about Ukraine, never have been to Ukraine, never spoken with an actual Ukrainian, and in many cases don't even know what language is being spoken in Ukraine, but they somehow know for a fact that Ukrainians are crucifying Russian-speaking children, or that the regime in Kiev is fascist. Now, another reason for why these things matter is purely economic. Under a Duginist world, we are all poor. It's just the way it is. There is no way you can have economic prosperity in Eurasia. And by that, I don't just mean the level of prosperity in a Duginist world would be, I don't know, marginally smaller because of the setup's inherent socialism and the fact that Dugin is quite open about the fact that Russians would get a disproportionate amount of the prosperity, just like in the Soviet Union, as Dugin readily admits. I don't mean just that. I mean it quite literally. Under the setup envisioned by Dugin, the level of prosperity of whomever might have the misfortune of falling under it will be, at best, at a tenth of what it is now. For instance, Dugin thinks the Republic of Georgia should be part of Russia. Now, if that were to happen, Republic of Georgia will for sure lose a significant degree of its prosperity. Now, however poor you might think, or one might think of Georgia is right now, there is always a possibility to have it a lot worse. Now, some anti-Duginists, and indeed Dugin himself, framed the whole thing as Russophobia versus Russophilia. Now, accepting such a paradigm is also in itself dangerous because it pushes Russia on a path to never recover. Again, Dugin is busy at home with fermenting more and more illiberal splinter movement, as if there aren't enough of those already. Now, Russia as a civilization, as Dugin likes to say, has been cut off from the rest of the world in 1917 and hasn't recovered to this very day. The proliferation of Duginism is almost a guarantee that Russia will never recover. I mean, it's hard to imagine today, but in 1910, Russia was on par with Britain and Germany in terms of culture, civilizational development, and was generally part of the Western world. Now, sure, the rural areas were less developed, but then again, on such a vast landmass, it's not an easy task, especially with 1910's communications and technology, to distribute development. I mean, it's one thing to be Britain, an island, archipelago, smaller than the tiniest oblast in Russia, and it's a whole other ballgame with Russia. But nevertheless, Russian culture was thriving and adding its own flavor to the Western culture. All of that was stopped in 1917 and the process was briefly resumed in early 2000s when Putin's grip on power was still weak and the country had started to catch up with the rest of the world. But then Putin became stronger and persecutions and old practices became normative again and the recovering process was once again stopped. To put it in a blunt language, a brighter future for Russia cannot exist as long as the state is run using a Duginist template. And despite victimology claims to the contrary, nobody wants Russians or Russia as a whole to suffer. In fact, I happen to quite like certain things about Russia. I mean, heck, I speak their language, and I think many elements of their pre-communist culture are worth something culturally and civilizationally, so to speak. So it is in my best interest to have a Russia that is prosperous, that is proud of its traditions, that tries to make amends of its past through cultural exchanges and cooperation, rather than tanks and invasions, and generally a Russia that can be a good neighbor. Now, none of those are possible as long as the status quo exists. Now, one final reason for which combating Duginism matters is the necessity of avoiding the occurrence of another big war. Now, Dugin isn't shy about the fact that he wants an all-out war. I mean, he states that repeatedly in his book Foundations of Geopolitics and in many essays and articles. But then again, when he's doing activism and instructing the on-the-field narratives, he claims that it's the West that wants war with Russia. Nevertheless, the not-so-old but otherwise true proverb that whenever money and merchandise don't cross borders, soldiers will, still remains true. So it's a simple choice, really. Fight Duginism now in the war of ideas, or fight the tanks later in an actual war, or deal with the aftermath of an internal war. Because one not so tiny little secret is that Russia has quite a few big problems itself, and not just economical, but social and demographical. I mean, 20% of the Russian military is already Muslim. The life expectancy of ethnic Russian men is 64, mildly higher than war-torn banana republics in Africa. So their replacement with much more disciplined populations, such as Muslims from Uzbekistan or mixed-race Asians from Kazakhstan, is going to happen quite fast, unless Russia starts addressing these things. But none of these problems are of any concern for Dugin or for the Kremlin. Think about it this way. The only country in deeper problem than Sweden demographically is Russia. So the idea that a Russian-centric geopolitical order would be a good enough alternative to the US-centric post-Cold War order is simply a fantasy. But anyway, I'll leave those considerations for a future video. So yeah, this is basically Duginism, how it works in practice and why it matters. So this concludes the longest and the hardest video I made since I started this channel. It took me 12 hours just to put all of the information together, not to mention the hundreds of hours spent to read as much as possible on the topic. At the very least, in putting this together, I knew where to look. I should probably also make a shorter version of this video, since I can't expect people to watch such a long video. But anyway, all of this is possible thanks to your generous support as patrons of this channel, and if you want to see more of these in-depth analyses, you know what to do. Research costs money because time isn't free, sadly, and this video alone, by the time I hit publish, would have eaten at least 18 hours of work, probably 20 hours. That's almost a part-time job for a week, so this week I'll be slower with new content because of this. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you once again for watching, thank you for your continuous support, and I'll see you soon on Freedom Alternative.